There is a house on a chalk cliff, 180 feet above the Thames at Taplow, where the river fog comes up the slope on October evenings so heavily that you can smell the wet beech leaves from the gravel drive before you can see the lamps in the south front. The light from the saloon windows hangs in that fog like a held breath. The avenue of limes runs straight as a ruler from the gates, and the gravel sounds different under wheels here than it does anywhere else in Buckinghamshire, because it has been raked since 1850 by men paid to rake it twice a day. 376 acres of formal gardens, a parterre cut from the side of the cliff in the French manner, a house faced in Caen stone and finished in 1851 by Charles Barry, the architect who built the Palace of Westminster. The Astor family's American eagle still cut into the stone above the entrance porch. 6 bays, 3 stories, a clock tower that strikes the hour at 1 minute past because Nancy Astor preferred it that way and nobody ever changed it back. What you are looking at is the third house to stand on this site. The first burned in 1795. The second burned in 1849. The third has stood for 175 years and has absorbed more political damage than any private house in England. This is the dark story of Britain's most scandalous manor. Part 2. Part 1 covered the 17th century duel in which the Duke of Buckingham killed the Earl of Shrewsbury while the Countess of Shrewsbury watched dressed as a page boy. It covered the Sutherlands, the Great Victorian Fortune, and the 1893 purchase by William Waldorf Astor, then the richest man in America, for £1.25 million. It covered the swimming pool, Christine Keeler, John Profumo, and the affair in 1961 that brought down a government. That story has been told. This story has not the duel, not the Profumo pool, not the chalk cliff. Cliveden is where the first American-born woman to sit in the House of Commons hosted weekend parties for the men who told Adolf Hitler that Britain would not fight, where the editor of the Times sat with the Foreign Secretary on a Saturday night in October 1937 and quietly agreed that the Sudetenland could be handed over without much fuss, where Joachim von Ribbentrop, later hanged at Nuremberg, sipped champagne under a sergeant portrait, where the phrase Cliveden Set was coined in a communist newsletter run out of a basement in Soho on the 17th of November 1937 and stuck for the rest of the century. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a Virginian girl who hated Germany. Nancy Witcher Langhorne was born in Danville, Virginia, on the 19th of May, 1879, the 8th child of a tobacco auctioneer who had fought for the Confederacy and lost most of what he had. She grew up in a country house called Mirador in the Blue Ridge Mountains, broke horses, broke hearts, and at the age of 18 married a Boston society alcoholic named Robert Gould Shaw II. The marriage produced one son, Robert Gould Shaw III, known all his life as Bobby. It also produced, by 1903, a divorce, which was scandalous in Virginia, social ruin in Boston, and the reason Nancy sailed for England that summer with her mother and her infant son on the cover story that she needed a change of air. She met Waldorf Astor on the ship, coming back from a second visit in 1905. He was the son of William Waldorf Astor, the American expatriate who had fled to England in 1890 after declaring that America was no longer a fit country for a gentleman to live in. Waldorf was 26. Nancy was 25. They shared a birthday, the 19th of May. They married on the 3rd of May 1906 at All Souls Langham Place. As a wedding present, William Waldorf gave them Cliveden House and most of its contents and went off to live on the Italian Riviera and not speak to either of them for the next 10 years. The Cliveden, the young Astors inherited in 1906, had been a Sutherland house for 60 years. The Duchess had laid out the parterre. The Duke had kept the racing yacht on the Thames. Edward VII had visited as Prince of Wales, walked the lawns, dined in the saloon, and approved. The plate alone, the silver gilt service for 40, was valued at more than £50,000 at 1906 prices, which is roughly £6 million today. The library held 26,000 volumes. The wine cellar held 40,000 bottles. There were 230 servants on the estate payroll. The head butler was a man called Edwin Lee, then aged 26, who had been hired by Waldorf's father and would stay at Cliveden until 1962, a service of 50 years, during which he would see everything. Nancy began her redecoration the week after the wedding. She tore out the heavy Sutherland velvets, replaced them with chintz, hung sergeant portraits in the dining room, and ordered roses from Reading by the bushel. She installed her son Bobby in the nursery wing, and forbade the staff to mention his father to him. She converted the French drawing room into a less formal room she called the Hall, where the great Cliveden weekends would eventually happen. She set the clock tower 1 minute fast. She was a comic. She was a snob. She was a Christian Scientist who believed alcohol was a poison and refused it to her guests at table, then watched them slip into the smoking room to recover. She was, by every account that survives, the most exhausting woman in England, and by 1914 she had made Cliveden the most fashionable Saturday to Monday house south of the Trent. The trouble, already in the house, in those first years before the First War, sat in the nursery wing. Bobby Shaw, Nancy's son by Robert Gould Shaw II, was by 1910 a tall, witty, charming 9-year-old who already understood that he was the family's hidden inconvenience. Waldorf was decent to him. Nancy was demanding. The other Astor children, beginning with Bill in 1907, slowly displaced him in the household. Bobby grew up at Cliveden, but was never quite of it. He was sent to Shrewsbury School. He went into the household cavalry. He was, by his early 20s, a charming alcoholic with a temper. He was also, in the language of the period, an invert. He preferred men. He was arrested in a public lavatory in 1929, and Nancy persuaded a police inspector to drop the charge in return for a substantial private contribution to the Metropolitan Police Widows and Orphans Fund. He was arrested again in 1931, more seriously, and this time the case went to Magistrates' Court at Marlborough Street, where he was bound over, and the proceedings were kept out of the morning papers by direct intervention from the Astor lawyers. There were 2 further arrests. There were 3 suicide attempts. Bobby was, for the rest of Nancy's life, the secret she spent more political capital concealing than any other. Cliveden absorbed him. Cliveden absorbed everything. Then the war came. The First War converted Cliveden into a Canadian Red Cross hospital. Waldorf, ineligible to fight on health grounds, threw himself into hospital administration and proprietorship of the Observer, which his father had bought for him in 1911. Nancy lost her brother-in-law Charles to the Western Front. Bobby, a teenager, became a difficult adolescent. The estate ran beds for 24,000 wounded soldiers over the 4 years of the war. The figure preserved in the hospital ledger, now held at the Reading University Special Collections under reference MS 1416-47. When the armistice came in November 1918, Nancy was already preparing for what came next. What came next was Parliament. Waldorf had been Conservative MP for the Sutton division of Plymouth since 1910. In October 1919, his father, William Waldorf, died, and Waldorf inherited the Astor Viscountcy, which immediately disqualified him from the Commons. The Plymouth Sutton seat fell vacant. Nancy stood. On the 28th of November 1919, she was elected with a majority of 5,000, and on the 1st of December, she took her seat, walked the length of the chamber on the arms of Lloyd George and Balfour, and became the first woman ever to sit in the House of Commons. Constance Markievicz had been elected the year before, but had refused to take her seat as an Irish Republican. Nancy was the first to sit. She would sit for 26 years. She was not a serious legislator. Her one substantial bill, the 1923 Intoxicating Liquor Act, raised the drinking age from 14 to 18 and was largely a temperance gesture. But she was a magnificent constituency MP for Plymouth, and she became almost immediately a power broker. Waldorf owned the Observer. Cliveden owned its Hostess. Her brother-in-law owned the Times after 1922. The combination Westminster seat, plus 2 great Sunday newspapers, plus one of the half-dozen most famous country houses in England, made Nancy Astor one of the 4 or 5 most influential women in the empire by 1925, and by 1935, the single most politically connected hostess in Britain. The Cliveden weekends began in earnest in 1922 and ran every fortnight for the next 17 years. Saturday lunch was for 40. Saturday dinner was for 30. Sunday lunch was for 60. The guest lists, preserved in the Astor papers at Reading, read like a yearbook of the British establishment. Stanley Baldwin came regularly. Ramsay MacDonald came. Lord Curzon came. Bernard Shaw, Nancy's closest non-political friend, came so often the staff kept a writing desk made up for him in the southwest bedroom. T.E. Lawrence came on his motorbike 3 times. Charlie Chaplin came in 1931, and Nancy made him sit at the piano and play. Joseph Kennedy came as American ambassador after 1938 with all 9 of his children, including the young John Fitzgerald, then a Harvard undergraduate, and Robert, then 13. The routine of the weekend was fixed and famous. Guests arrived by car at 5 on the Saturday afternoon, were shown to their rooms by Edwin Lee personally, dressed for dinner at 8, drank in the hall before the gong, dined in the saloon under the Sargent portrait of Nancy, painted in 1909, retired to coffee and Madeira in the library, and were in bed by 11:30. On Sunday morning, the senior members of the party walked the parterre with their host or hostess. The juniors played tennis. Lunch was the political session, with Nancy at the head of the long table, forcing arguments across it. Tea was at 4 on the south lawn. Guests departed before dinner on Sunday evening, so that the household could be reset for the working week. Nothing about the routine was unusual. Half of England's great houses ran a Saturday to Monday on the same template. What made Cliveden different was the caliber of the political conversation and the proximity to power of the people having it. Nancy's particular gift, the one that produced the Cliveden Set as an unintended consequence, was her instinct for political introductions. She would seat a backbench Labour MP next to a duke. She would put Lloyd George beside a debutante. She would walk a German ambassador round the parterre and ask him about his wife. Her enemies called this naive interference. Her friends, more accurately, called it the most effective informal diplomacy in interwar London. By 1932, the Cliveden guest lists were being studied at the Foreign Office in a quiet way as an index of which way the political wind was blowing. By 1935, with Baldwin back as Prime Minister, Cliveden was, by some assessments, the second most important political house in England after Chequers. By 1937, it was arguably more important than Chequers. Chequers belonged to the office. Cliveden belonged to Nancy. The difference mattered, and the German ambassador came. Joachim von Ribbentrop, blonde, vain, and ridiculous, arrived in London in August 1936 as Adolf Hitler's personal envoy to the court of St. James's. He attended his first Cliveden weekend on the 15th of November 1936. He attended 6 more in the 18 months that followed. Waldorf, who spoke fluent German, conducted long conversations with him in the library. Nancy, who spoke no German at all, made fun of his accent at table and then walked him round the parterre, asking serious questions about what the new Germany really wanted. Ribbentrop went home and told Berlin that the Astors were sympathetic. He was not entirely wrong. He was not entirely right either. Nancy's pro-German sentiment, such as it was a mixture of 3 things. The first was a Virginian Protestant horror of Bolshevism so profound that any continental regime that could plausibly contain Soviet expansion was preferable to one that could not. The second was a generation-deep belief, shared with Philip Kerr, that the Treaty of Versailles had been morally wrong in its German provisions, and that justice required revision. The third, and this was Nancy's contribution rather than the consensus's, was a snobbish American conviction that the British would do almost anything to avoid being lectured by Americans, which made it incumbent on her to lecture them anyway. The combination did not amount to a pro-Nazi politics. It did not amount to fascism. It did amount, in the saloon at Cliveden to a willingness to listen to Ribbentrop's case with more patience than the case deserved, and to encourage British ministers to do the same. Waldorf was no better. Through the Observer he ran, between 1933 and 1939, a steady editorial line that British rearmament was being demanded too quickly, that the German government's grievances were partly legitimate, and that direct negotiation with Hitler was preferable to collective security through the League of Nations. He was not Goebbels' puppet. He was a sick, decent, well-intentioned proprietor with a wife who entertained the German ambassador and a brother-in-law who edited the Times, and the cumulative effect of those connections on British public opinion in the years 1935 to 1938 was incalculable, but not zero. Then, in 1937, came the dinner. Lord Halifax, then Lord President of the Council, and shortly to be Foreign Secretary, had been invited by Nancy in the summer of 1937 to spend a weekend at Cliveden with what she described in her letter as a few people who care about Europe. He arrived on Saturday, the 23rd of October, 1937, with his valet, his red box of state papers, and an unwritten brief from Stanley Baldwin to listen to whatever Nancy's circle had to say about Germany and then go to Berlin and say it back to Hitler. He found waiting for him at the door Geoffrey Dawson, editor of the Times since 1923, and a man who had already spent 4 years systematically suppressing dispatches from his Berlin correspondent that were critical of the Nazi regime. He found Sir Neville Henderson, just arrived from his appointment as British ambassador to Berlin. He found Thomas Jones, the small Welsh civil servant who had been Baldwin's deputy cabinet secretary and was Nancy's principal channel into the inner workings of government. He found Philip Kerr, 11th Marquess of Lothian, Nancy's most intimate political confidant, a Christian Scientist like her, a former private secretary to Lloyd George, and a believer that the Treaty of Versailles had been a moral catastrophe Britain owed it to Germany to revise. He found Waldorf. He found Nancy. He did not find Ribbentrop, who had been there the weekend before. The fire in the saloon was lit at 9 o'clock that night. Edwin Lee, the butler, recorded the time in his diary, kept then in a school exercise book in the butler's pantry, and now preserved at the Reading University Special Collections under reference MS 1416. The entry for the 23rd of October 1937 reads in full: saw Lord H. and Mr. R. in the saloon. The fire was lit at 9 p.m. Lord H. had the Madeira. Mr. D. spoke for some time. The Madeira was 1864. Mr. D. is Dawson. What they discussed has never been precisely reconstructed. Halifax's own diary entry for the following morning, the 24th of October, 1937, written in his small, careful hand and preserved at the Borthwick Institute for Archives at the University of York, records only that the company had been agreeable and that we walked round the parterre in the morning and discussed the Sudeten question with surprising unanimity. The surprising unanimity was that the Sudetenland could be transferred to Germany without a fight, that the Versailles Treaty's German clauses were morally indefensible, and that British rearmament should not be pushed faster than the economy could bear. All four positions were, within 12 months, formally British government policy. 3 weeks after the Cliveden dinner, on the 17th of November 1937, a small communist newsletter called The Week, edited from a basement office in Victoria Street by a journalist named Claude Cockburn, published an item which has since become one of the most quoted single paragraphs in British political journalism of the 20th century. Cockburn wrote that there was now operating in the salons of certain great country houses a coordinated political faction whose object was the surrender of British foreign policy to the Third Reich. He named Cliveden as its headquarters. He named Nancy Astor as its hostess, and he gave it a phrase that no amount of subsequent libel suit or denial ever managed to dislodge. Cliveden, he wrote, the quietly insistent crucible of British appeasement, where Hitler's case is heard out and Britain's case is muffled. 2 days later, on the 19th of November 1937, Lord Halifax flew from Croydon to Berlin and was driven by Ribbentrop's car to Hitler's mountain retreat at the Berghof above Berchtesgaden. He spent 4 hours with Hitler. He mistook him at first for a footman and tried to hand him his coat. He then sat down and, according to his own subsequent account, indicated to Hitler that Britain would not stand in the way of an adjustment to the German-speaking populations of Czechoslovakia and Austria, provided it was done without force. Hitler took the meeting as the green light it more or less was. The Anschluss followed in March 1938. The Sudeten crisis followed that summer. And on the 7th of September 1938, 3 weeks before the Munich Agreement was signed, Geoffrey Dawson published in the Times a leading article whose central sentence had been drafted by Dawson's own subsequent admission in his private diary at Cliveden the previous weekend. If the Sudeten Germans now demand a more wholesale union with their kinsmen by an adjustment of frontiers, no one is likely to object. The leader was read in Berlin as confirmation that the British press, the British Foreign Office, and the British political class would not resist the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Within 21 days, the Munich Agreement was signed and the Sudetenland transferred. Neville Chamberlain came home waving his piece of paper. The Cliveden Set, as a self-conscious faction, never really existed. Cockburn admitted to friends, years later, that he had invented the term as polemic and watched it ossify into history. But the dinners had happened. The unanimity had been real. The transfer of British policy from the Foreign Office to Nancy Astor's parterre in that particular October 1937 weekend had been measurable. Stanley Baldwin himself, dictating to Halifax in the weeks afterwards, observed with the dryness of a man losing his grip on his own party. In a remark Halifax recorded in his diary on the 11th of December 1937, Nancy means no harm, but she is the chief amateur ambassador to a regime that means us all harm. The saloon, where the fire was lit at 9 on the 23rd of October 1937, is still there. It is now the main lobby of the Cliveden House Hotel. The fireplace has been repointed. The Madeira has long since been drunk. The diary lies in a box at Reading. The policy lies in the rubble of half a continent. The aftermath of Cockburn's article is, in some ways, the most revealing part of the whole episode. Nancy denied the Cliveden Set existed. She denied it in letters to the Times, denied it in interviews with the Daily Mail, denied it from the floor of the House of Commons. Waldorf denied it through the Observer. Geoffrey Dawson denied it in private and never wrote about it in the Times. Lord Halifax denied it in his diary, which is to say he wrote on the 4th of December 1937 that there was nothing to deny. The denials, en bloc, achieved the opposite of their intent. By the spring of 1938, the phrase Cliveden Set had been picked up by Reynolds News, by the New Statesman, by the Manchester Guardian, by the New York Times. Cockburn, who had invented the term as a piece of left-wing agitation against the Times' editorial line, had stumbled into the most successful piece of British political branding of the decade. The Cliveden Set existed because everyone now believed it did. That belief was, by the end, more politically consequential than the actual conversations in the saloon had been. Bernard Shaw, ever the loyalist, defended Nancy publicly in a long letter to the Tribune on the 14th of March, 1938. The Cliveden Set, Shaw wrote, was a journalistic fiction concocted by communists for the consumption of fools. The fools who consumed it were, in his view, every newspaper editor in England. Nancy framed the letter and hung it in the small sitting room at Cliveden. It is still on the wall there, although now the room is a hotel residence lounge, and most guests walk past without looking. And then the War Halifax, and Henderson, and Dawson, and Astor, and Lothian had all said could not happen. Nancy did not see it coming, and did not adjust quickly when it came. On the 4th of December 1939, 3 months after Britain had declared war on Germany, she rose at a public meeting in Plymouth Town Hall and gave a speech which was reported in the West Country newspapers the following day, and then, more widely, by London journalists who had travelled down to hear it. "We have got to know this country called Germany," she told the assembled audience of Plymouth dock workers and shopkeepers, "before we presume to tell it how to live." She meant, by every charitable reading, that the British public had been ignorant of the German national character and had to learn it before negotiating a peace. She was heard, by every uncharitable reading, to be saying that Britain had no business fighting Hitler. The speech was widely reported. The damage was instant. From that December onwards, Nancy Astor was, in the public mind of wartime Britain, the woman who had encouraged Hitler. She did not stop. She kept her seat. She kept hosting Cliveden weekends, though smaller and increasingly defensive. She kept writing to Bernard Shaw, who defended her in print, calling her, in a Sunday Times article of the 21st of January 1940, the most honest patriot in England, which did her no good with anybody. She kept speaking at Plymouth, and in 1941 the German bombers came for Plymouth. The Plymouth Blitz of 1940 and 1941 destroyed the city centre. 40 raids, 1,200 dead, 15,000 houses destroyed. Nancy and Waldorf, both in their 60s, walked the rubble nightly. Nancy in her Lord Mayor's badge, once she was sworn into that office. In November 1942, Waldorf gaunt and exhausted, organising rest centres and feeding stations and rehousing for the bombed out. Whatever else Nancy Astor was, in those 18 months she was a Plymouth MP doing her job under fire. She danced with sailors on the Hoe by torchlight in the spring of 1941 to keep up morale. She was photographed standing in front of her own bombed-out constituency office. The photograph appeared on the front page of the Plymouth Western Morning News on the 23rd of April 1941 and is now in the Astor papers. Cliveden became, for the second time in a generation, a Canadian Red Cross hospital. 24,000 wounded were treated there between 1939 and 1946. Edwin Lee, the butler, stayed on. John Owens, the head gardener since 1928, converted the South Lawn into rehabilitation ground for wounded soldiers learning to walk again. His two elder sons were killed at Normandy in June 1944. The middle son, Henry, survived and worked beside his father until 1959. Bobby Shaw spent the war years moving in and out of nursing homes and discreet hotels. He drank. He attempted suicide for the third time in 1942 and was treated at a private clinic in Hampshire, paid for by his mother. He sent her letters, preserved in the Astor papers, that veered between affection and accusation. He blamed her more than anybody for the impossibility of his life. She wrote back, in the language of a Christian Scientist, that there was no such thing as illness and no such thing as failure. The correspondence is among the saddest in modern British political archives. Waldorf's health collapsed during the war. He had been a sick man since 1935. By 1944, he was bedridden. In the autumn of 1944, he told Nancy that she could not stand again in the next general election because, he said, her political moment had passed and her continued presence in the Commons embarrassed him. The argument was bitter. The argument lasted weeks. Nancy capitulated. On the 21st of January 1945, she rose in the House of Commons to make her farewell speech. She had served Plymouth Sutton for 25 years and 2 months. She was, by every measure, exhausted. She thanked the House. She paid tribute to the women who had followed her into Parliament since 1919, 24 of them by then. She said she would miss the chamber more than she could express, and then she sat down and did not speak in Parliament again. She did not forgive Waldorf either, and they lived increasingly separate lives until his death on the 30th of September 1952. In 1947, she made a final, characteristic, disastrous attempt to remain politically relevant. She travelled to Moscow as part of a delegation and arranged a meeting with Joseph Stalin. The Daily Express published her account on the 12th of August 1947 under the headline Nancy and the Marshal. She had told Stalin, she boasted, that his country was full of slaves. Stalin had laughed. Whitehall winced. She came home, retired to Cliveden, and in the years that followed, maintained a thinned guest list of friends who would still come. Bernard Shaw came until his death in November 1950. Lord Lothian had died in Washington in December 1940 of uremic poisoning, the result of his Christian Science refusal of treatment. Halifax had been packed off to the Washington Embassy in December 1942 and never lived politically in England again. The Cliveden Set, such as it had been, was scattered by the war it had failed to prevent. In 1952, Waldorf died, and Bill Astor, the third Viscount, inherited the house. What happened next at Cliveden is the story of part 1. Bill Astor allowed Stephen Ward, a society osteopath, to use Spring Cottage on the estate from 1956 onwards. Christine Keeler swam naked in the pool on the night of the 8th of July 1961. John Profumo, Secretary of State for War, met her there. He lied to Parliament on the 22nd of March 1963. He confessed on the 4th of June 1963. Ward died of an overdose on the 3rd of August 1963. The Macmillan government fell. The Conservative Party fell after it. Bill Astor was socially destroyed by the trial, abandoned by his friends, and died of a heart attack on the 7th of March 1966 in the Bahamas at the age of 58. Cliveden was vacated by the Astor family in 1968 and passed to the National Trust, who had held the freehold since 1942 in lieu of Waldorf's death duties. Nancy outlived her son Bill by less than 2 years. She had been suffering small strokes since 1959. She died at her daughter Wissy's home in Lincolnshire on the 2nd of May 1964, at the age of 84. Her last words, reported by her family to several biographers and now part of the Astor record, were a sentence directed to the relatives standing round her bed. "Am I dying?" she said, "or is this my birthday?" She was buried at the Octagon Temple at Cliveden, the small mausoleum at the bottom of the parterre, beside Waldorf. But the house that absorbs the modern hotel guest and the modern wedding party was not built by the Marquis of Buckingham, or the second Duke of Sutherland, or the first Viscount Astor, whose American eagle is cut into the porch. It was kept upright by the people who lit its fires, polished its silver, and walked its parterre when the politicians had gone home. Their presence at Cliveden is documented, recorded in ink on paper. Their stories are not. Edwin Lee was butler at Cliveden from January 1912 to December 1962, a service of just under 51 years. He was born in Crewe in 1886, the son of a railway clerk, and was hired by William Waldorf Astor at the age of 26. He served 3 generations of Astors, 2 world wars, the Cliveden Set, the Profumo affair, and the slow disintegration of the household around him. His wages in 1912 were £80 per annum, with board and lodging. His wages in 1962, his final year, were £960 per annum. He kept a diary and school exercise books from 1912 onwards. The diary, 23 volumes, came into the Reading University Special Collections in 1971 under reference MS 1416. The entry for the 23rd of October 1937 reads, "Saw Lord H. and Mr. R. in the saloon. The fire was lit at 9 p.m. The entry for the 8th of July 1961 reads, "Pool party for Mr. Ward. The young lady from London. Mr. Profumo arrived at 11. There are entries for every day of his 50-year service. We know he married once, in 1924, to a Cliveden housemaid named Florence Tucker. We know he had no children. We know he retired to a cottage in Taplow Village and died there in November 1970. We know nothing else." Mrs. Rose Harrison was Nancy Astor's lady's maid from October 1928 until Nancy's death on the 2nd of May 1964, a service of 36 years. She was born in Aldfield, Yorkshire in 1898, the daughter of a stonemason. She came to Cliveden at the age of 30 as Nancy's third lady's maid in 8 years, and outlasted all her predecessors by surviving the woman she called, in private, my lady, the lioness. She was paid £60 per annum in 1928, rising to £200 in 1955. She wrote her memoir in 1974, dictated over 6 months to a journalist named Leonard Buckley, and it was published as Rose, My Life in Service, by Castle in 1975. It became, against expectations, one of the few first-hand accounts of upstairs Astor life that historians still trust. We know she never married. We know she retired to a small house in Knaresborough, bought for her with Nancy's bequest. We know she died there in March 1989. We know nothing else. John Owens was head gardener at Cliveden from April 1928 to October 1959, a service of 31 years. He was born in Maidenhead in 1880 to an estate carpenter and grew up on the grounds. He maintained the parterre, the long garden, the rose garden, and the Italian garden through 2 world wars. During the Second War, he converted 12 acres of formal lawn into rehabilitation, walks for wounded Canadian soldiers, and grew vegetables in the cutting garden under the Ministry of Food's Dig for Victory programme. He was paid £2 and 8 shillings a week in 1928. He was paid £6 a week in 1959. He had 3 sons. The 2 elder, William and Robert, were killed within 7 days of each other on the 22nd and 29th of June 1944 in Normandy. The younger, Henry, worked beside his father from 1945 onwards and inherited the head gardener's post in October 1959. We know John Owens lived in the head gardener's cottage on the estate. We know he died there in February 1962. We know nothing else. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger in the Cliveden estate office, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. Edwin Lee lit the fire in the saloon for Lord Halifax. Rose Harrison brushed Nancy Astor's hair the night before her farewell speech. John Owens raked the gravel for Joachim von Ribbentrop's car. We know only that they were there, that the house they served is still standing, and that their names survived, 3 of them, because the Astor Estate Office kept its accounts and the family kept the diaries, and nobody threw the ledgers away. In 1942, with Waldorf failing and Cliveden running as a wartime hospital, the National Trust accepted the freehold of the estate in lieu of estate duty. The Astor family retained the right to occupy under a lifetime tenancy. They did so until 1968, when Bill Astor's son William, then 36, surrendered the tenancy to the trust. The trust, unsure what to do with a house whose principal recent association was with Christine Keeler, leased the building in 1969 to Stanford University in California, who operated it for 16 years as a residential graduate study center. In 1985, the Stanford lease ended and the trust signed a new lease with a hospitality company called Cliveden Limited, which converted the main house into a 5-star hotel with 38 bedrooms. The hotel opened in 1986. It now operates at an average occupancy of 80% and serves approximately 80,000 guests per year. Room rates begin at £600 per night and rise to £4,000 for the Lady Astor Suite, which is the room in which Nancy slept for 46 years. The swimming pool, the same swimming pool in which Christine Keeler swam naked on the night of the 8th of July 1961, is open to guests between 7 in the morning and 10 at night. The Spring Cottage, where Stephen Ward held his weekend parties from 1956 to 1963, is rented as a self-catering lodge for £1,200 per night and sleeps 6. There is no plaque to Ward and no plaque to Keeler. Guests are told the cottage is named for the spring in the woods behind it. David Cameron held a senior Conservative strategy weekend at Cliveden in March 2012 during the early months of his coalition government. Boris Johnson, then Mayor of London, attended a spectator summer party there in July 2014, walked the parterre and was photographed beside the fountain. Neither weekend produced a Cockburn. The Cliveden weekends of the modern era are smaller, lighter, less consequential. The clock tower still strikes the hour at 1 minute past. Edwin Lee's diary still lies in its box at Reading. The Astor eagle is still cut into the stone above the porch. The hotel staff today number approximately 320. The head gardener employs 11 full-time ground staff and a further 15 seasonal labourers from March to October. The wine cellar holds an inventory of approximately 28,000 bottles, of which around 200 are pre-war, and a handful are pre-Astor. There is, in the deepest part of the cellar, a small locked alcove that contains 4 bottles of the 1864 Madeira. The hotel does not list them on its drinks menu. A bottle, by recent auction comparable, is worth approximately £14,000. The hotel sommelier will, for a private dinner in the saloon on the right occasion, open one. The right occasion is not specified. Most guests will never see the bottles. Most guests will never know they are there. The octagon temple at the bottom of the parterre, where Nancy and Waldorf lie, is open to the public. Bill Astor is buried there too, beside his parents, in a smaller marker added in 1966. The temple is in plain Portland stone with a leaded roof. It is locked at night. In the spring of 2018, Vandals broke the lower panel of the door. The lock was replaced. The temple has not been broken into since. Bobby Shaw is not buried at Cliveden. He died in 1970 in a private nursing home in Berkshire of cirrhosis of the liver, and was buried in a London cemetery whose location the family did not publicise. His grave is unmarked. The National Trust, which holds the freehold, draws an annual ground rent from Cliveden Limited of approximately £350,000, which it spends on maintaining the gardens, the parterre, and the rest of the estate that is open to the public. 220,000 day visitors come every year. Most of them never see the saloon. The saloon is hotel territory. You have to be a paying guest or someone's wedding party to stand in front of the fireplace where Lord Halifax warmed his hands on the 23rd of October 1937. But you can walk the parterre. You can stand on the chalk cliff and look down at the Thames. You can find, at the bottom of the formal gardens, the small octagon temple where Nancy and Waldorf are buried. You can read the inscription. You can think about what was decided there and what was not decided, and what the people in the saloon believed they were doing. Stand at the saloon's west window on an October afternoon. Stand at the saloon's west window on an October afternoon, and the parterre falls away from you in concentric green ovals down the side of the chalk cliff, and the Thames is a brown ribbon in the middle distance, and the beechwoods on the far bank are turning the same copper they turned for William Waldorf Astor in 1893, and the same copper they turned for Lord Halifax in 1937. The light is exactly the same light. The river fog is exactly the same fog. The clock tower strikes the hour at 1 minute past, as it has done since 1907. And if you stand there long enough, with the autumn smell of wet beech leaves coming up the slope, you can almost convince yourself that no decision was ever taken in the room behind you that altered the shape of a single life in continental Europe. The saloon is too pretty. The view is too composed. The Madeira has been drunk. The fire has been repointed. Cliveden is not one house. It is the record, in cairn, stone and chalk, and silver gilt plate, and bound diaries of a particular British conviction. The conviction that politics is best conducted in the country, over claret, between people who already know each other, that the people who have always run things should continue to run them, that the world's problems are smaller than they appear from London and softer than they appear from Berlin, and that a quiet word in a saloon can settle what an army cannot. Cliveden held that conviction for 200 years. Cliveden tested it to destruction in October 1937. Cliveden has been absorbing the consequences ever since. The House has, in a strange way, kept faith with that conviction. It is still a place where powerful people go to be invisible. The hotel runs a registration policy that is, by ordinary five-star standards, unusually discreet. The diary in the basement archive at Reading Records in 1937, the time the fire was lit. The hotel computer at the front desk records in 2024 only the room number. It is the same house, doing the same job, for slightly different clientele. It is a curated memory of itself. Nancy Astor wanted to be the first woman in the Commons. The House gave her the platform from which she became one. She wanted to be a peacemaker between Britain and Germany. The House gave her the parterre on which Ribbentrop walked beside her. She wanted to keep her son Bobby out of the newspapers. The House absorbed Bobby's arrests, his disgrace, his 3 suicide attempts, and gave nothing back. Waldorf wanted the Observer to be the conscience of a new Britain. The House gave him the proprietor's chair and the bedroom upstairs in which he died. Bill Astor wanted to be liked. The House gave him Stephen Ward and a swimming pool and a broken heart. Halifax wanted to keep Britain out of a war he believed could not be won. The House gave him the Madeira and the saloon fire and the unanimity on the parterre. Hitler wanted Britain to stand aside. The House gave him, through Halifax, the signal that she might. The House gave them all what they asked of it, in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The House always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. Edwin Lee lit the fire. Rose Harrison brushed the hair. John Owens raked the gravel. The Madeira was the 1864. The clock tower struck 1 minute past, and nobody in the saloon on the 23rd of October 1937 asked the butler what he thought. Who does a building like Cliveden belonged to? The Astor family who paid for it? The Sutherland Duchess who laid out the parterre? The 230 servants on the 1906 payroll? The 24,000 wounded soldiers who recovered in its wards? The hostess who held court in its saloon? The foreign secretary who took its conclusions to Berlin? The butler who saw everything and wrote down only what time the fire was lit? The American expatriate who fled here in 1893 because his own country had disappointed him? The 80,000 modern hotel guests who sleep in its bedrooms each year and never read a word about Ribbentrop? The National Trust, which holds the freehold and counts the visitors and rakes the gravel and cleans the silver and keeps the place going? Cliveden does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands on its chalk cliff 180 feet above the Thames at Taplow, the third house to stand on the site, and lets you decide. In the Reading University Special Collections, in a temperature-controlled vault on the second floor of the main library, there is a cardboard archive box numbered MS Vault 1316. Inside the box, wrapped in acid-free tissue, are 23 school exercise books written in the careful copperplate hand of a man who left school at 13. The books are the diary of Edwin Lee, butler at Cliveden House from 1912 to 1962. The entry for the 23rd of October 1937 reads in full, "Saw Lord H. and Mr. R. in the saloon. The fire was lit at 9 p.m. Lord H. had the Madeira. Mr. D. spoke for some time. The diary stayed in the butler's pantry at Cliveden until December 1962. Then it went into the cottage in Taplow village. Then in 1971, it went to Reading. It is still down there. It always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.